We move into 2 Samuel 9 today as we continue to look through David's acts of royal consolidation, as you can see on the right side of the screen there, in these chapters from 2 Samuel 5 to 10. And here today we're in these 13 verses, and I and you may be sorry I'm trying to do this all in one video today. It may be kind of long, but it just seems like it's such a tightly integrated narrative that there's no way to break it into pieces. So we're going to look at this whole chapter here, which is situated, as I've been noting, in between the two stories of David's growing and glowing reputation and his defeating enemies, really the reports of his success, as we can see here in this situation. And although I have not noticed other scholars doing that, I'd like to suggest that there's a tight parallel here between not only these three chapters and these three chapters from 1 Samuel 24 to 26, but also some nice connections here between our story in 2 Samuel 9 and the story of Nabal in 1 Samuel 25. Not least of which is because, as I noted at the time, many scholars note Nabal as a stand-in for Saul, his name meaning fool. And so what I'm suggesting is here, in a context where David is stealthily confronting a Saul who's oblivious of the threat that David is, and Nabal becomes the stand-in for that, as David ends up threatening Nabal, but coming out with Nabal's wife, Abigail, and a prize package that Abigail brings, and Nabal ends up dead. Here, in the opposite context, here David is in his rise into power. He'd already been anointed by Samuel to be the successor, but obviously Saul was not allowing it to happen. So we saw David as the one in waiting beneath the power of Saul. And now it's reversed. David is the powerful king, and the remnant of Saul is cowering at his feet. And in both situations, Abigail falls down at David's feet, and here Mephibosheth falls down at David's feet, the only people that fall down at David's feet. So tight connections here. I'd like to suggest this is David on the way up, and this is David just about on the way down. And one of the tools I was fortunate to be able to get that really helped me understand this, I'll present it to you, is the doctoral dissertation here from Cephas Tushima, which is challenging just to get an access to, but I persisted because he has a whole chapter on this chapter here, a chapter in his dissertation on our chapter in 2 Samuel 9. But he highlights, as I'll show you here directly from his book, a little chiasm of scenes around Mephibosheth throughout. And what we see is, and he notes, and I won't play it out in detail, how as the stories unfold, the injustice of David is increasingly obvious. And I'd like to really suggest that's relevant here because we just saw in the last scene the narrative of David establishing Mishpat Usedekah, justice and peace in his kingdom. And we noted last time that Mishpat, the justice of the king, called us back to 1 Samuel 8, where he saw the so-called justice of the king was to take. And so what Tushima is showing out here, that's playing out in the so-called justice that we see to the house of Saul here. And we'll see it in a number of ways. Interestingly, some recent scholars want to see this as an act of genuine kindness on David's part, showing compassion to a disabled person. But that really discounts the entire narrative context, not only of our immediate scene, as I'm noting here, this is part of his taking control, but also, as I just showed you from Tushima's chiastic structure spread out through 2 Samuel, how it's really highlighting David's injustice, not his justice. So as we look at that, we're going to look at a couple of tools. Some we've already used. A close-up here on the key words for these three chapters that I've been showing to highlight how dominant a few key words are. King, 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 over against servant, servant, servant. As Paulson says, the language of obeisance and servitude is throughout this chapter. But house as well. House of Saul 3 times immediately. The house of an obscure person who we never meet. And then house down here as well in Ziba's house. So the emphasis on house, obviously not as a building, but as we saw in 2 Samuel 7 just a couple chapters ago, around the house of David, the question of a monarchy, the question of the whole community of people who are gathered, first around Saul and then around potentially around Ziba at the end. And then finally, this phrase that's repeated 4 times about eating at the table always. And that's connected here, the key words is connected to an interesting aspect of this chapter where there are phrases that are repeated, not necessarily multiple times, such as key words, but repeated unnecessarily in this chapter in the sense that they're not providing new information and we already know it. And you can see in their color coding just how many of those there are. I won't go over those in detail now, but we'll see them as we go. But emphasizing at the beginning, the chesed question comes up 3 3 times here, parallel as Tushima notes to the situation in 1 Samuel 20. And so he highlights a number of parallels between 1 Samuel 20 and our chapter here, which is the chapter where the covenant with Jonathan, between Jonathan and David, takes place, that's being referenced here in verse 1, the Hesed for Jonathan's sake. So let's look at that too. He shows these 7 connections here. And again, I won't go over them in detail. You can see what they all are. And I didn't highlight the parallels in 2 Samuel 9 because we're going to go over those here. But certainly we're meant to read that in connection with this, as well as looking forward to the other places where Mephibosheth comes up in the story. And I'll bring this story in 2 Samuel 9 back into play when we get to chapter 16 and chapter 19, and we see what happens with Mephibosheth later. So that's our situation. So let's put our key words up here as we begin to go through our story. And as often, I've been translating it over here a little closer to what the literal means so we can highlight some things that the New RSV tends to cover up. So you can see from my note below, I suggest there's a little chiasm of speakers here in this passage, so you can see that right there. And so David asked, and literally not asked. If it had asked, it would be Shaul, so that would be a nice play on words that David Shaul'd about the house of Saul. But in fact, it's just simply he said. And we need to look very carefully at what's being said because a lot of this is hidden. Is there still anyone? Literally, is there a man? Contrasting with verse 3, where it doesn't say a man. And using the word left here, noter lebet, literally a remnant of the house. And as my note says below, at the beginning, the request is ambiguous. It's kindness for Jonathan's sake, but also political concern for remaining quote-unquote contenders within the house of Saul. And that's plainly what's at issue. David doesn't start off looking for a disabled person to show compassion to. He looks for someone from the house of Saul. And we see, as I noted before, that house of Saul was mentioned 3 times, and Saul is mentioned so many times, and we've hardly heard Saul in any of these surrounding chapters. We may have even forgotten about him all the way back to chapter 3 and 4, when last time we'd heard about anybody related to the house of Saul. So, is there any remnant? And he suggests, may I show kindness? And as Graham All notes below, it is very hard to decide how ironically chesed is used here. And I think that's exactly the point. But it's taken in people throughout the ages up to this moment that this is actually David trying to show chesed against every other behavior he's done to the house of Saul other than to Jonathan. And this is Jonathan's son, as we're going to see here, but... So, there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And already we have to ask some questions. Why does the house of Saul need a servant? What is remaining of the house of Saul? We obviously saw that Saul and Jonathan were killed at the end of 1 Samuel. But what do we know about anybody else? We've not seen other sons. We know about Michal, but Michal has already abandoned David, as we know, from chapter 6, just a few chapters ago, and they never had children. So what other house of Saul might there be? And does David really not know? Is it possible that David has not kept track of potential enemies out there? Or is this a rhetorical question? And who is he saying this to? He's seemingly saying it just to the heir because the last scene was a summary of past behavior. So there's not been a live scene since back to chapter 7. So he's just saying this to the heir, and yet the narrator intervenes to tell us that there was this servant of the house of Saul named Ziba, first mentioned here, and as I was noting, we'll see him again. And he was called to David. Notice it doesn't say the servant, but a servant, suggesting there are other servants, but this is the only one we hear about. And in fact, we'll hear that Ziba himself has 20 servants of his own, in addition to 15 children. So the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And it's an unusual thing. Why would he need to ask this? It never happens before that you request someone in particular to come and they come, and you have to confirm the name. But it's suggesting that David doesn't know these people. And as my note below suggests, is that believable? We'll have to decide for ourselves. The "at your service" covers over here the exact parallel with Mephibosheth's response, "I am your servant." But, and this is just a mistake made by the rendering on my computer screen, so I'm sorry for that. So "at your service" covers up. It makes it sound like he's much more affirming than what really is, "I am your servant." But notice he doesn't bow down before the king, as Mephibosheth will do, perhaps because he's not afraid. But why wouldn't he be afraid? If he's a servant to the house of Saul, you'd think that he would be just as afraid as Mephibosheth, which suggests that Ziba has at least multiple, if not mixed, motives here, and we'll see that as we go, thanks to Shima's good work. So he was called to David, and he said, "Are you Ziba?" And we've already done that. So now we hear the king's response. he asks him, is there anyone remaining here, using a different phrase, ha'afes adish. And my note below notes that the word literally means extremity or ceasing, according to the Brown Driver Griggs lexicon. And Toshima has a note of 3 uses of the term. And I won't go through all the grammatical details here. You can look at that. You can freeze the frame for yourself and look at it for a moment. But he notices it's only used in interrogative sentences in this place and one other. And therefore he concludes, quote, consistent with the word's intrinsic function of negation, the answer to the question is expected to be negative, denying either the existence of a surviving solide or the perpetuity of divine wrath, respectively. So it's expecting a negative answer. Again, is that rhetorical or is that literal? Would David really know that his best friend Jonathan didn't have a son? We'd never heard of it, but how could that happen? That he seems to have, as far as we can see, an adult son too, that David doesn't know about. So there are real questions about, is David performing here, or is he asking authentic questions? And Ziba said to the king, and I didn't highlight it as a key word, but notice how it alternates between David and the king. I highlighted the king as a key word, but David a bunch of times. It's only King David once in this scene, and so another theme we could look at is when is he called David and when is he called king? He's called King David right here, as you can see. So the king said, in his role as king, right here, this is where I'm sorry, remaining. And Ziba said to the king, there remains a son of Jonathan, not the son, again suggesting there are more. And the NORSV has he is crippled in his feet. But Toshima notes that there's no verb or no pronoun there, so he sees it as crippled feet. He says, knowing David's antipathy toward the lame and the blind, which we saw back in 2 Samuel 5:8, instead of Mephibosheth's name, Ziba volunteered a nickname, Crippled Feet, a demonstration of Ziba's contempt for Saul's only surviving heir, which would suggest that Ziba is trying to curry favor with David for obvious reasons and separate himself from Mephibosheth, loyalty at least to Mephibosheth, so by calling him this derogatory name, Crippled Feet. And of course this leads a number of modern scholars to raise rightly questions about how the disabled are portrayed, but I'd like to suggest this isn't just an abstract story of how the disabled are portrayed. It's a symbolic story about the disability of the house of Saul, as a number of scholars have noted. It also has another contrast that we'll see at the very end. So the king said to him, where is he? And it raises the question again whether he doesn't know or whether he's in hiding. Samora suggests down below that it's likely the two families went into hiding after Ishbosheth's death, who was murdered in his bed, and that certainly would not be surprising. But Ziba said to the king, he is in the house of Machor, omitting, as in Norse, almost always a behold. Toshima suggests that the use of it here is in a grammatical form that suggests, translating it, there he is in the house of Machor. And again, the house of Machor, as I note here in the repetition phrase, is repeated twice. This Machir, son of Amiel, who we never hear about, why does that need to be repeated twice, other than emphasize that someone from the house of Saul is in somebody else's house, sort of a neutral house, not David's house and not Saul's house. The phrase lo debar literally means no word, but Toshima suggests that if Crippled Feet is the properly derogatory nickname, we could render this as Nothing City. So to say that Saul's heir is Crippled Feet living in Nothing City, and that would continue the derogatory behavior toward him. And so then King David sent and brought from the house of Machir, and brought him, and we note that we'll find out that he calls Ziba later as if Ziba left, but we don't hear that he's left. And we don't hear how much time it took, nor do we know how far it away is. Scholars recognize we have no idea where Lo Debar is. There are a few possibilities, but we really just don't know if it's just down the road or if it's just a fictional place for the purpose of the narrative here, because we have no reference to it otherwise. So it would appear to be that the next scene is David and Mephibosheth alone, or with Ziba, but we'll find out later that it's alone. So the phrase sent and brought, literally send and take, it's one of the echoes from chapter 20, as I was noting from that chart. And now he comes, and notice he's given this entire name again. We already met him back in chapter 4 when we first heard about the nurse dropping him and he was lame. So we don't need to know that, and we already know this, but it's really highlighting the combination. Son of Jonathan, yes, and son of Saul. So Jonathan, David's best friend, obviously, but highlighting he's also a Saulite. And he fell on his face into obeisance, here again echoing we saw from 1 Samuel 20:41, and from Abigail to David, as I was suggesting there, the only other place that somebody bows down to David. and disobeisance. And David calls him by name, and he says, I am your servant, again matching the henna that we saw earlier. And I'll scroll down so we can see the rest of our scene. And we can imagine when David says, do not be afraid, that Mephibosheth is terrified. He knows exactly about the fate of Ishbosheth, his uncle, and we know that Jonathan, his father, is dead, so he's out here apparently under the only supervision of Ziba, who's simply a servant, and as we know, and probably Mephibosheth knows, not exactly a fan. So he rightly is terrified that his life is at an end. And David says, do not be afraid, for I will show you the chesed for the sake of your father Jonathan. Obviously not for the sake of Saul. And as we'll see later, this will anticipate many parallels with the Absalom story, including the fact that Mephibosheth and Ziba are both involved in the Absalom story in chapter 16 and 19, about David's ambivalence here about this person. He obviously is ambivalent about Absalom, his son, who is also rebelling against him, and he's ambivalent here because he would like to protect the son of Jonathan, but he doesn't want to risk a Saulite challenging him for the throne, which is exactly what will happen during the Absalom rebellion. So David is not wrong to be concerned about that, and Mephibosheth is not wrong to be afraid. So he says, for the sake of Jonathan, I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, knowing the word father, Ab, is the same used for father and grandfather. He'll literally return. And it begs the question of what we don't know. When did he get it? When did he appropriate the land of Saul? We'd never heard that, just a number of the other things that are going on in the background here. But the word for land here is Sedah, for field, the agricultural land. It's neither Eretz, the generic word for land, or Adamah, which is the word for the generic topsoil, the land from which life comes, but Sedah, a specific piece of agricultural land. But it's echoing 1 Samuel 20, when David and Jonathan were out in the Sedah playing the archery game to plot how they would respond when David didn't show up. Where? At the king's table. Another parallel there. So you shall always eat at my table always, using the word tamid here. And as a number of scholars have noted, the irony here is it's only these three places in either book of Samuel. It will be used here for the Queen of Sheba in 1 Kings 10. But the most important part is at the very end here, and we'll look at that and see where the last king in the monarchy dined regularly at the king of Babylon's table, clearly highlighting that he's being kept away. And as I was noting in the previous scene, the other echoes that anticipate the end of the story in Babylon, David's taking of gold and silver and copper from the people described here in chapter 8 that then are taken by the king of Babylon. So we're going to see a number of hints here that this is showing how it all comes around full circle. So here's Mephibosheth's response here. What is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I? In addition to being self-deprecating, it's a key phrase. It's the phrase David used of himself in 1 Samuel 24:14, another one of the links in that section. We'll also see it in 2 Samuel 16:9 and 10, and we'll also see it in 2 Kings 8:13. I won't show those now, but as Schipper, another commentator on this, notes, it refers to someone who's an enemy of the king. And so that's what he's naming here, why should somebody who David rightly sees as a potential, at least, enemy of the king be treated so well? But the rhetorical question just lies there. So now the king summons Ziba. Notice he's highlighted as Saul's servant Ziba, and we'd have the dead Saul. And so obviously the dead Saul needs no servant, so Ziba's role here is ambiguous. And he said, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And now as for Ziba, you and your sons and your servants, how does David know he has servants? The narrator tells us down here he does, but how does David know that? Shall till the land for him. I note below highlights it's a command, not an invitation. David is officially showing hesed to the house of Saul, but he's also capturing any remaining chance of Saulite resistance. And till the land for him, the Adamah, not the Sedah, and you shall bring in the produce. There's no object in the Hebrew here, so literally bring it in, so your master's grandson may have food to eat. And as Baden notes below, this arrangement means that even though he has him under the name Meribabal, an alternative name here, is eating at the king's table, he's not eating of the king's food. He is in effect paying for his own imprisonment. And indeed that is the case here. And Old notes the same point. Now we hear that Ziba has 15 sons, which is okay, but why the 20 servants? Why would someone who's a servant to the house of Saul, which as far as we know only has one member, have 20 servants? As Teshima notes below, the large number of servants at Ziba's disposal, along with his many sons in the same service, may indicative of his high rank in Saul's palace, comparable to a contemporary chief of staff of a president or a governor. But although Teshima is a very close observer, one would wonder what house of Saul is left that needs someone with that much authority and that many servants. So going down to just our last verses here. So Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord, the first time that he's being deferential here, other than he called himself servant, the king commands his servant, so he will do. But Ziba has an interest in this, as we'll see. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And as Auld notes below, this faces him with two options, that the treatment is up to royal standards, or Ziba is insisting that Mephibosheth will always get such treatment. And then we hear, seemingly parenthetically, because it isn't relevant to anything else that happens, Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. So there is one more, but he's not mentioned again. But that leaves the potential that there's another there. Does he have a wife? We don't hear about that. And we don't hear that this son is with him or that he's at the king's table. But mustn't he be? Nor do we know how old he is, other than he's described as young. So all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. But is that right? And there's a real question about that. As Teshima notes, there's a perspectival dissonance here. Neither David nor Ziba see anyone as Mephibosheth's servant. So what exactly is going on there? We'll have to wait to chapter 16 to investigate that further. But here we get to the great irony at the end. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and he always ate at the king's table. So as we heard in chapter 5, verse 8, the blind and the lame shall not come in to Jerusalem. Now someone who's described as lame, using the exact same word, is brought in. And as Teshima notes below, there's an ironic turn of events in this respect. David, whom the blind and the lame were supposed to keep away from Jerusalem, takes residence in Jerusalem. Similarly, David, who has barred the blind and the lame from his citadel, compelled the lame Mephibosheth, who might have preferred to reside elsewhere, to dwell in Jerusalem, not only dwell in Jerusalem, but dine at the king's table daily. And that's the great irony there. So Halper notes that Ziba is getting a good deal here. He may be even siphoning some of the profits of the produce of the land back to David. We'll find out more about their relationship in chapter 16. But for now, David has taken the only adult, at least, Saulite, and kept him at his table, just as the king of Babylon kept the last surviving king of the monarchy at the table. And we'll continue in chapter 10 to see David's record of success, but knowing that the seeds of the undermining that will begin in chapter 11 have already been placed before alert readers. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.